a frozen mountain in northern Italy, February 1945. 3 times men had charged up this slope. 3 times they had been thrown back down it, leaving the snow behind them stained and silent. The peak had a name the soldiers had come to hate, Monte Castello, and the men dying on its slopes had come from the other side of the world, from beaches, from jungle, from cities where it never, ever snowed. They were Brazilians, and almost no one, then or now, believed they would be here at all. There was an old joke in Brazil. People said it was more likely that a snake would pick up a pipe and start smoking than that Brazil would ever send an army to fight in Europe. So when Brazil did exactly that, its soldiers stitched a snake onto their uniforms. A snake, smoking a pipe. This is the story of the smoking snakes, the only Latin American nation to send its sons across an ocean to fight in the Second World War. This is the story of how the snake learned to smoke. To understand why this was so unlikely, you have to understand where Brazil stood in 1942. The war was a distant thunder. It belonged to Europe, to the deserts of Africa, to the islands of the Pacific. Brazil was a vast, sun-soaked country, ruled by a dictator, watching from the far edge of the map. No Latin American nation had ever sent ground troops to fight overseas. It simply wasn't done. And then the war came to Brazil, without warning and without mercy. In the summer of 1942, German U-boats slipped into Brazilian waters and began sinking ships. Not warships, merchant vessels, passenger ships, over 30 of them, sent to the bottom. Hundreds of Brazilian civilians drowned, men, women, and children who had never held a rifle. The country erupted. Crowds filled the streets, demanding a response. And the dictator who ruled Brazil, a man named Getulio Vargas, found that for once he could not look away. In August 1942, Brazil declared war on Nazi Germany. But declaring war is one thing. Fighting it is another. Brazil's army was small, under-equipped, and untested. The idea that it could be shipped across the Atlantic to fight the German war machine seemed absurd, to allies and enemies alike. The cynics had a phrase for it. They said Brazil would join the fight when snakes smoke. It was meant as an insult, a way of saying, never. The soldiers heard it, and they decided to answer it, not with words, but with a patch on their shoulder, a snake, a pipe, smoke curling into the air. A cobra vai fumar, they said. The snake is going to smoke. Now they only had to prove it. On July 16, 1944, the first Brazilians stepped off their troop ships into the ruins of Naples. Roughly 25,000 men would make this crossing. The Força Expedicionária Brasileira, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the FEB. They were attached to the United States Fifth Army, thrown into the long, grinding Italian campaign. Most of them had never left Brazil. Many had never seen snow. Some had been told they were going to fight in the deserts of North Africa. Instead, the mountains were waiting. The Apennine Mountains in winter are no place for the unprepared, and the men from Brazil were the least prepared of all. Their own uniforms and boots, issued back home, fell apart in the cold and the mud. They survived on American gear, American food, American ammunition, American coats, but it was never enough. One account put it simply, in those mountains, none of the men of the FEB ever felt truly warm. Imagine it. You grew up under a tropical sun, and now you are dug into frozen rock, watching your breath freeze in the dark, an enemy you cannot see somewhere up the slope. And rising above them was Monte Castello, a peak the Germans had turned into a fortress. From its heights, German artillery commanded the whole valley. Every road, every approach, watched by guns that could not be silenced. To advance, the Fifth Army needed it taken, and the task fell, again and again, to the Brazilians. Monte Castello would become their white whale, the mountain they could not let go of, the mountain that would not fall. The first assault came in late November 1944. The Brazilians climbed into the teeth of German artillery, across open, frozen ground. They were thrown back. They tried again. Thrown back. On the 12th of December, In brutal weather, they took some ground and lost around 150 men doing it. And still the peak held. 3 times the FEB hurled itself at Monte Castello. 3 times it failed. Each failure was measured in young men who would never go home. Each failure fed the doubt, the old jeer echoing in the snow. Maybe snakes don't smoke after all. The winter dragged on, and then, in February 1945, the weather finally broke. The Fifth Army planned a new offensive, Operation Encore, and once more, Monte Castello was the objective. But this time would be different. This time, the Brazilians had learned the mountain. They moved into position through the night, seizing the high ground inch by inch. 3 battalions, ready at the base of the peak that had beaten them 3 times. At 6 o'clock in the morning, on February 21, 1945, the final attack began. If the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, FEB, 1944-45, the only Latin American nation to send ground troops overseas in WWII, approximately 25,000 men attached to the U.S. Fifth Army in Italy, who took Monte Castello on the 4th attempt, captured 20,573 Axis troops, including the only intact German division to surrender on the Italian front, and earned the nickname, the Smoking Snakes, from a snake smoking a pipe patch. Fascinate you. You're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We drop a new story every single week. Now, back to the Smoking Snakes, Brazil's forgotten army that fought Hitler. And this time, the Brazilians did not look up at the sky and see only enemy guns. This time, they looked up and saw their own. For the first time, Brazilian pilots, the 1st Fighter Aviation Group, flew overhead, covering their own countrymen on the ground below. On the slopes, the 1st and 11th Infantry Regiments climbed into the fire, up the same ground that had killed so many before them, into the same German guns, but they did not stop, and then, after a fierce, close struggle near the top, it was over. Monte Castello fell. On the same morning, the Americans of the 10th Mountain Division took the neighboring peak, Monte Belvedere. The German line in these mountains was cracking open, but for the Brazilians, this was personal. The mountain that had broken them 3 times was theirs. The snake had smoked. Monte Castello was the turning point, but not the end. The Brazilians pushed north into the German line's collapse, and in April 1945, they reached a town called Montese. It would become the most arduous, bloody fight the FEB ever faced, street by street, house by house, and it was here, on the 14th of April, that 3 Brazilian soldiers walked into legend, 3 men on patrol. Their names were Geraldo Baeta da Cruz, Arlindo Lucio da Silva, and Geraldo Rodrigues de Souza. The oldest was 28, the youngest 25. They were ambushed by a German force far larger than their own. The Germans called out for them to surrender. It was the only reasonable thing to do. They were outnumbered, surrounded, with no hope of escape. The 3 men took cover, and they opened fire. They fought until their ammunition ran out. And then they were gone. All 3 of them, killed where they stood. What happened next is why we still remember them. The Germans, the very men they had been fighting, were so struck by their courage that they buried the 3 Brazilians with honor, and over the grave they left a cross. On it, in German, were 3 words: Drei Brasilianische Helden. 3 Brazilian heroes. Their enemies had given them the highest tribute one soldier can give another. Decades later, a Swedish band would search the internet for the word heroes, stumble onto this grave, and write a song so the world would not forget. They called it Smoking Snakes. The war in Italy was now in its final days, and at the end of April 1945, near the town of Fornovo, the Brazilians achieved something remarkable. They surrounded the German 148th Infantry Division, and its commander, General Otto Freder Pico, surrendered the entire division to them. Nearly 15,000 German and Italian fascist troops, laying down their arms over the course of a single day. It was the only intact German division to surrender on the entire Italian front, and it surrendered to the men a dictatorship had sent abroad, as an afterthought. By the war's end, This supposedly impossible army had captured more than 20,000 Axis soldiers, 2 generals, nearly 900 officers, at a cost of fewer than 500 of their own dead. There is a bitter irony at the heart of this story. Brazil's soldiers had crossed an ocean to fight fascism, to fight for freedom and democracy in Europe, but they had been sent by a dictator. Getulio Vargas ruled Brazil with no elections, no free press, no democracy at all. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. How could a regime send men to die for democracy abroad while denying it at home? The war the FEB fought helped tear that contradiction open, and in October 1945, just months after victory in Europe, the military removed Vargas from power. The men who fought for democracy overseas had, without firing another shot, helped bring it home. You might think the veterans came home to a hero's welcome. They did not. The men who had taken Monte Castello, who had captured an entire German division, were treated as a threat. Many were forbidden to wear their medals or their uniforms in public. Career soldiers were posted to remote frontier garrisons, far from the cities, far from politics. They were given little help with the wounds they carried, in their bodies and in their minds. A government that feared what these men represented chose, quietly, to push them into oblivion. The pratinhas, the affectionate name Brazil gave its foot soldiers, were celebrated in stone and forgotten in life. And yet, Brazil could not forget them entirely. Across the country today, there are nearly 200 monuments to the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, almost 3 monuments for every 7 men who died. A nation that struggled to honor its veterans while they lived has covered itself in stone to remember them now that they are gone. And the snake still smokes. It is worn on the shoulders of Brazilian soldiers to this day. The Brazilian army still sings their song. The grave at Montese is still tended. They were told it would happen when snakes smoke, meaning never. But they crossed an ocean. They endured a winter their bodies were never built for. They climbed the same deadly mountain 3 times until it finally fell. 3 of them died refusing to surrender, and even their enemies called them heroes. 25,000 men from a tropical country went to war in the snow and proved the cynics wrong. The snake smoked, and it has never stopped.